Today, we're going to be speaking with David Graham, who's a staff writer at The Atlantic and also author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Project: How Project 2025 is Reshaping America. David, so good to have you on. You know, we're at this moment right now. We're a few months into the second Trump term. We're in the middle of this budget negotiation, which is it going to ultimately be the Senate or the House that decides what happens, who might kill the bill, who will pass the bill? DOGE is sort of on its way out, although it's really Elon who's out and DOGE is nominally still going. It might be a good place to start in terms of, based on what we knew about Project 2025 from the documents prior to the inauguration of Trump. How relevant have its goals been during these first few months? What has been done to achieve its goals?
I think in the first 100 days or so, what we saw and where they've been very successful is in what Project 2025 laid out as a plan to seize control of the executive branch, take powers from Congress, take powers from independent agencies, lay off civil servants, cut government departments. So we saw all of these things happening very effectively. And those things are essential to what they view as then a policy platform. And I think we see more recently some of the attempts on the policy platform. So when I look at the bill in Congress, I see Project 2025 priorities all over it, and that needed to some extent the groundwork they've laid.
When it comes to DOGE, it seems the primary overlap is DOGE as the tool to fire a lot of those civil servants. But is there more to the overlap between Project 2025 and what DOGE has done?
I think that's the big one. I mean, you see things like closing the Department of Education, which is something laid out in Project 2025. But DOGE claims to be about efficiency, but it's obviously mostly about cutting government. And Elon Musk came into the government without really understanding a lot about how the federal government worked, as we saw. And so for Project 2025, that was for the authors, it was very helpful. They had somebody who was willing to sort of go in with a wrecking ball and had Trump's ear and would do all of these things that they wanted to do while dispensing with some of the legal niceties.
Ignoring court orders, as an example, we saw it in terms of the denial of due process to people who have been deported. We've seen that in a bunch of different places. Is that either philosophically or logistically part of Project 2025?
I think it's especially philosophically part of it. And it's not so much that they are opposed to the courts per se. It's that they have this almost religious faith that the Supreme Court will back them up. And if they can challenge things to the Supreme Court, they will win. And they say over and over, these where there are these laws, we understand that we are violating the laws, but we believe those laws are unconstitutional. And what we've seen over and over is the Supreme Court, once they get those cases, no matter what lower courts have done, is saying, yeah, you're right. You can go ahead and do this. You can go ahead and fire the heads of independent agencies. And so they're having a lot of success in that approach.
When it comes to something like Christian nationalism, there's this wacky video. I don't know if you saw it. I think it's a wacky video from about 10 days ago of the faith office of the president with people speaking in tongues at a spot I've stood at. And when I stood at that spot outside the White House, there was nothing like this going on. We had a different president at the time, but all of a sudden you had people speaking in tongues just outside the White House. What is the role of religion generally and maybe Christian nationalism more specifically in Project 2025?
I mean, I think that's the most important thing about all of this. It's very important to look at the policies. It's important to look at how they're taking over the executive branch. But all of this is in the service of a Christian nationalist vision of American society. And that's something that, that's a term that a lot of people on the right resist, but it's something that Russell Vogt, who's one of the lead authors of Project 2025, and obviously now the head of the Office of Management and Budget, he embraces that term. And so what they want to do with all these things is they want to reorient American society around that Christian nationalist vision. And they want to have, religious organizations taking care of social programs. They want American society oriented, they say, around a biblically based vision of the family. They want strict gender roles. They want religion in schools. So I think that's very much at the heart of all of this.
One of the things that I remember talking about in 2024 related to Project 2025, or maybe this actually applies more in 2023, is that the architects of Project 2025 saw it as a vision that could be implemented by any president, at least in theory, and that would outlive whoever had 4 years in the Oval Office. Now, it pretty quickly became clear that there wasn't an appetite among Republican primary voters to choose someone other than Trump. So Trump became sort of like the de facto guy who was going to oversee it, but that really the ideas could have been carried out by anybody, and also that they will kind of outlive the next presidency. In terms of the outliving the current presidency, what would you say has been done so far that is going to go beyond Trump? And maybe it's reversible by the next president, or maybe it isn't. But like, where are we in terms of the legacy of this after Trump leaves office?
I think these changes to the executive branch are very important and they're going to be durable. A lot of these things are done by executive order, and so they look like they're going to be fragile. But if you think about, laying off thousands of federal workers, closing up research shops that have existed for many years, cutting off big projects, cutting off, major regulations, these things are hard to spring back up quickly. And so I think that we're going to have a really permanent impact, even if courts overrule some of these things, and no matter who the next president is. And generally, what we're seeing is disempowerment of these independent agencies, disempowerment of Congress. And so that's going to encourage a stronger president, and a president who can defy checks and balances, I think, for the foreseeable future.
Do you have a sense of how much the vision of Project 2025 really reflects Trump's sincere beliefs, to the extent that he has any? And how much of it is like he's really just a vessel and this is a useful thing for him to allow, but that it's not really reflective of his political philosophy? And again, it's sort of a tough question because I don't know that he really has a political philosophy other than like, what can help me win?
Right. I think what the authors realized is that Trump has a few things he cares about a lot. He cares about immigration. He cares about tariffs. He cares about retribution. And they found ways to work around that. So, many of them come from the more free trade side of the Republican Party historically, and they understood they weren't going to win that fight. And so they basically surrendered on tariffs. They care about immigration. They're happy to go with that. They care about things like seizing control of the Justice Department for reasons of political philosophy. He cares about it because he wants to use it to punish his opponents. And then everything else, they realize that, by providing a strong set of employees, people who are going to be loyal, they can get what he wants done and what they want done. So I think it's really a sort of symbiotic relationship, and he is a vessel for them.
In terms of what's going on in the Department of Health and Human Services with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I don't remember looking as deeply in the pre-November 2024 era at the degree to which Project 2025 is what we might nominally call like anti-science or conspiratorial when it comes to some of these medical and science institutions. Can you kind of like lay that out? Is what we're seeing as the approach from RFK Jr. related to Project 2025, or is it sort of its own outcropping?
I think there's some overlap. They're not exactly the same. I mean, what Project 2025 sees for health and human services, I think, is many of the most Christian nationalist views. They're really traumatized by churches being closed for Easter 2020, for example, by public health authorities. So they're very skeptical of public health authorities for that reason. They're skeptical of vaccines for pro-life reasons. They believe that vaccines are a violation of the pro-life principles. They want to ban abortion. They also have a skepticism of pharma companies and regulators as a sort of revolving door, which is something that I think we've seen very much from Robert F. Kennedy, obviously. So there are places of overlap, but I think it's a place where maybe some of their priorities have been eclipsed a little bit by Kennedy's.
One of the things that I find interesting in a kind of dystopian and terrifying way is that for a while, it seemed as though the kind of prevailing narrative within MAGA, let's say, not necessarily Project 2025, not necessarily Republics, but within MAGA was extremely skeptical of government surveillance, extremely skeptical of anything that puts our data in the cloud, skeptical of ceding any kind of power to big tech. And I think you can see where I'm going with this. We now have, on the other hand, ideas, including from RFK Jr. and others. Just a couple of weeks ago or last week, he said he wants everyone with a wearable so that then, rather than making sure no kid goes hungry, get everybody a wearable, and then something happens with the data. And it's interesting because in the past, I think some of these folks would have said, wait a second, insurance companies could get that stuff and say your resting heart rate is high. We think you're a risk. We're going to charge you more money, or you're only getting 5 hours of sleep a night, and so we don't want to insure you. There would have been like a skepticism about some of these ideas. What does Project 2025 say about data, tracking, surveillance, this sort of stuff?
So I would divide it a little bit. On the one hand, there's a real skepticism of big tech inside Project 2025. It was written before Elon was inside the Trump tent.
Hmm.
And they're concerned about data. They're concerned about controlled speech by tech companies, where they would rather grab that control, I think, for the government. They're concerned about the effect of technology and social media on children. But in a broader sense, and this is where I think one of the more radical things about Project 2025, I think, there is a willingness to embrace real coercive government power. Things that the right, at least in lip service, has said or has criticized in the past. They worried about too much government control, and they've worried about an overweening federal government. And what you see in all sorts of areas, including data, is a willingness to use the federal government to their ends, to force states, to force individuals, to sort of to trample, I think, on a lot of civil liberties in order to achieve what they want to do.
When it comes to the civil liberties stuff, um, when it comes to, as some examples, sending in national troops to states, as we saw in California, or take your pick, so to speak. Where is Project 2025 philosophically on that? Because on the one hand, certainly blowing up and increasing the power power of the executive branch, firing people, shrinking these departments, there is an authoritarianism in that, but it does seem distinct from we're straight up sending in the troops to California, for example. Is that under the Project 2025 umbrella?
They talk about using troops within the U.S. for immigration enforcement.
Okay.
And using them in a role that has not been contemplated by any president in the past, not even Trump in his first term. They don't talk about the same deployment of troops to the streets, but I think they're opening the door to uses of troops domestically in a way that connects very closely to what Trump is doing now.
And as far as the people around Trump, who are the individuals who you would say are the most closely linked to Project 2025 that have made it into Trump's inner circle?
The most important one, I'd say, is Russell Vought, who's at the Office of Management and Budget, and who grasped how he could use OMB as a kind of control center to force a lot of these priorities on departments. So he's a very important one. Another one is Peter Navarro, who's an influential trade advisor who wrote a chapter in favor of protectionism.
Yep.
I think a third one is Brendan Carr, who is the head of the Federal Communications Commission and has spearheaded, ideas to defund PBS and NPR, or to try to revoke broadcast licenses from broadcasters who criticize Trump. There's various other people. John Ratcliffe, the head of the CIA, is involved. You can sort of run down the list. I think those three are the ones who have been most influential so far in this administration.
I want to briefly just shift gears in our last few minutes here. I saw that about 10 days ago, or closer to 2 weeks, you wrote a piece for The Atlantic, Trump's Trouble with Tulsi. And I found that article really interesting because I've been following the Tulsi Gabbard thing ever since she was the last true liberal and the only actual anti-war candidate back during the Democratic primary of, it was 2020, right?
Right.
Yeah. And I personally never fell for what I thought was the sham. And this very interesting thing kind of came to a head where she presented a report that actually did seem to reflect what the intelligence community believed about Iran's proximity to nuclear weapons in March, which Trump just dismissed multiple times as, I don't care, I believe that they've almost got it. What do you think? On the one hand, we were hearing she's going to get fired. This is completely untenable. On the other hand, because of everything else going on, the Tulsi fired stuff has kind of died down. And even though she's publicly kind of missing, maybe she's not as front and center in Trump's mind right now. Give us your overall assessment of what you believe her future is within this administration.
She's in a very difficult position anyway. The director of national intelligence is this spot where, they're supposed to have a sort of oversight role of all the intelligence agencies. They don't really have a lot of control over people like the CIA director, especially if the CIA director, like John Ratcliffe, has an existing relationship with Trump.
Hmm.
And there's a desire to crack down on intelligence agencies from Trump, who's been skeptical of them really since his first inauguration. And I think her connection with Trump was that she was also skeptical of the intelligence agencies, but she wasn't skeptical of them because of agendas they were pushing, not sort of per se. I don't know how she finds a way out of this. I think she clearly opposes American intervention, and she maybe believed that Trump did But that's not really where he's coming from. He's happy to intervene in a limited way. So I think, she was in an untenable position probably from the beginning. It has become more untenable. But Trump is so reluctant to fire anybody this term. You can imagine her hanging around in the administration as a sort of sidelined concern for a good long time.
Is she maybe kind of like a loyalty type pick where there was a group of people that were advantageous to Trump's campaign? Her leaving the Democratic Party and then becoming MAGA was just sort of useful, and he ended up kind of feeling like he just had to find something for her to do.
I think that's a good way to think about it. And it's interesting to compare her to somebody like RFK, who, early on appeared like he might be one of those, but has since emerged as a real power center in the administration.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's a place where his priorities don't conflict with Trump's, whereas her priors maybe do, and so that's creating this conflict.
Well, we're going to follow it. We've been speaking with The Atlantic's David Graham, also author of the New York Times bestseller, The Project, How Project 2025 is Reshaping America. David, thanks so much for being on today.
Oh, thank you.